What's up, St. John? Father Jonathan, the start of a new week, and that means another video. And today we're going to start what I think is going to be a series of 3 videos on the question of what God is doing in the midst of this crisis that we find ourselves in. And we start today with a very difficult question to answer. Why does God allow the coronavirus to happen? Why does God allow the coronavirus to happen? Now, behind that question is a much bigger question that people have been asking basically as long as there have been people, and certainly Christians and Catholics have been wrestling with this question for a very long time too. This is, in theology, this is called the problem of theodicy, Theodicy. And the question there is, why does God allow evil and suffering at all? And this is, in fact, one of the best arguments that sometimes gets made against the existence of God, or at least against the existence of our Christian understanding of God, right? Because we believe as Christians, as Catholics, that God is all-loving and all-powerful. And the way this question is posed, well, you know, if God is all-loving, He wouldn't want there to be evil. He wouldn't want there to be suffering in the world. That's not very loving. So, because there is evil and suffering in the world, either God is not all-loving, and He actually does want to harm us in some way, or He's not all-powerful, right? There's evil and suffering in the world He doesn't want there to be, but He is powerless to stop it, okay? What's the response to that? Well, in these short videos, I'm not going to be able to give you brick by brick every piece of how the church understands what the answer to that question is, or the kind of answers that theologians have been wrestling with for a long time. But hopefully I can at least start to point you in the right direction where you can start to find out more and get more of a sense of what the answer to that might be. One of my favorite writers and theologians, as many of you know, is the writer C.S. Lewis, and the 20th century writer C.S. Lewis. He wrote a book in 1940 called The Problem of Pain, where he explored this question. I highly recommend it to you. It's easy to read. It's not very long. I think it's less than 200 pages. And it'll give you much more in-depth look at what I'm talking about than I'm able to give you here. But one of the things that Lewis says in that book is this. Lewis says, evil is a deviation from the way things ought to be. But there can't be a deviation from the way things ought to be unless there is a way things ought to be. Now, what does that mean? Well, what Lewis is pointing out there is that the way that we respond, the way that we react to say, oh, there really shouldn't be evil, there really shouldn't be suffering in the world. The only reason we can do that is because somewhere deep within us is a sense of what good looks like, a sense of what the world ought to look like. And the only way that we can have that sense is, ultimately, Lewis shows, if God gave it to us, if He is the one who placed it within us. That doesn't answer our question, though. Why is there suffering and evil in the world, and why is God permitting this coronavirus thing to happen? We know God doesn't do evil, right? And so that's part of the Christian response, would be to say that God doesn't do evil things. Is God the one who's killing people with this disease? No. You know, we know God doesn't cause evil. And yet we do have to acknowledge that God is permitting this evil, right? I mean, obviously, we're living through it. We're all sitting in our houses right now, shuttered up because of it. So why? Why does God permit evil to happen in the world? Well, there are a lot of different ways of getting at this, but in a summation, in a short period of time, I'm just going to point out 2 main reasons. 2 main reasons why God allows suffering and evil to exist in the world. The first is that God allows evil and suffering to exist in the world because of human free will. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this one because it doesn't really apply very much to the situation we're talking about with the coronavirus. It has a lot more to do with moral evil, you know, with the terrible things that human beings do to one another, the sins that human beings commit. God allows us to commit these things, to do these things, because God has instilled in us free will. Why? Because we were made to love Him and to love each other. But love can only be love if it's chosen freely. You can't be forced to love something or to love someone. Which means if we're going to have the choice to freely love God and love others, we have to also have the opposite, the choice not to freely love God or freely love others. Okay, that's a whole thing. We'll put that aside for a second. The second reason why God allows evil and suffering to exist in the world is a little bit more pertinent to our situation, because we're talking about natural evil, right? The evil we're talking about with the coronavirus, you know, the fact that people get sick, that they die, that people lose their jobs, all those kinds of evils. It's more similar to like when there's a hurricane or a earthquake or something like that, where nobody's specifically causing the thing, right? No human being, at least, is specifically causing the thing. Nevertheless, there are evil consequences of it. So the second reason why God allows evil and suffering to exist in the world is so that He might bring a greater good out of it. So that He might bring a greater good out of it. If you know the story of Joseph from the book of Genesis, you know that Joseph had a number of brothers who were very jealous of him because his father liked him best. And so the brothers decided to get back at Joseph by selling him into slavery. Pretty crummy thing. You guys have probably done crummy things to your brothers and sisters before. Probably nothing as crummy as selling them into slavery, right? But that's what happens to Joseph. And yet, after Joseph is sold into slavery, eventually he starts to have prophecies and dreams and visions that come to him from God. This eventually leads him, after a fair amount of suffering, to become an important advisor to the Pharaoh, an important person in Egypt. It allows him ultimately to help the people of Egypt, including the Hebrew people who were there at the time, to avoid dying of famine, of starvation. And at the end of the book of Genesis, we see Joseph actually getting to confront his brothers, getting to see them again. And they really don't know how to respond, what to make of this. But one of the things that Joseph says to them in Genesis chapter 50, verse 20, Joseph says to his brothers, "What you meant for evil, God meant for good." What you meant to do to me for evil, God meant for good. What does he mean by that? He means that what ultimately was the lesser evil of his own personal suffering when he was sold into slavery ultimately leads to this greater good. He could never have been able to prevent the famine, to save the lives of many, 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 many people if he hadn't first gone through that suffering. And so the lesson that this teaches us is that God draws greater good out of evil. And it's true even in the ultimate sense, right? I mean, the ultimate evil that the world has ever known is the crucifixion, is the killing of Jesus. We murdered our own God on the cross. And yet out of that evil, God brought the greatest good that the world has ever known, the forgiveness of our sins, and the defeat even of death itself through the resurrection. And so the cross today is a symbol of goodness and hope, despite the fact that it was, in its own time, the ultimate sign of evil. Now, that answers the question at a certain level, right? It answers the question. But that answer is not satisfying to us much of the time, for two reasons. First one being, we don't always see how God has used whatever happened for good. God sees the whole picture. We only see a very small part. And so it might be easy for us to look at something like, say for instance, the American Revolutionary War. Look back at that and go, okay, I can see how God used the evil of that war, because of course every war has evil involved with it, but I can see how God used the evil of that war to create something good, right? Here we are today, living in the United States of America, a wonderful country with many wonderful advantages and good things happening in it. okay? Probably didn't feel that way, though, to the people who were actually living through that war. And when you and I look at evil just in our own recent history, it can be very perplexing. It can be very difficult because, again, we only see a little bit of the picture. God sees the whole thing. So it's not satisfying for that reason. But the real reason why that answer is not satisfying is because behind the question, when somebody asks, why is God permitting suffering? Why is God permitting evil in the world? Behind that is the much more personal question. Why is God permitting evil to happen to me? Why is God permitting me to suffer? Or somebody I love, somebody who's close to me to suffer? And even though we can look at those situations and say, okay, God is going to draw some greater good, it's never going to feel like that, right? Because we're right there in it. And all we can see is the terribleness of it. And that will certainly be true, I think, with coronavirus, especially as we see the sickness move through our community, as we see more people get sick, as we see more people die. It's not going to feel very satisfying when it's somebody that we care about, or if it's somebody that we care about, to say, well, God permits it. So what's the answer to that? Well, the good news is that there is much more to say about that, and we're going to say it in tomorrow's video, okay? I hope I've just whet your appetite for tomorrow's video. I hope you all are doing very well. I hope you're staying inside. I hope you're staying healthy, washing your hands, and God bless you all. I miss you very much, and I look forward to seeing you hopefully soon, but certainly in the meantime, seeing you on tomorrow's video. Until then, grace, peace, and love.